Hello, my name is Sue Pepin. I serve as the Director of Health and Clinical Partnerships at Arizona State University. I want to welcome you all to our third of 4 events in our Biomedical Innovation Series. Today's topic is bridging the gap between data science and medicine. I want to thank the Arizona Biomedical Research Center for sponsoring the series and Arizona State University Knowledge Enterprise for the work they do in fostering innovation through research and discovery. The structure today will be about 40 minutes of a fireside chat, starting out with some opening comments with our speakers, followed by 20, 15 minutes of questions and answers and discussion. Please, if you have questions, if you would write them throughout the webinar in the question chat box, and we will try to get to them. So it is my great pleasure to introduce 2 real leaders in this space of data science and health. Dr. Melissa Haendel is the director of the Center for Data to Health at Oregon Health and Science University and the director of translational data science at Oregon State University. Dr. Haendel's vision is to weave together healthcare systems, basic science research, and patient-generated data through the development of data integration technologies and innovative data capture strategies. She currently does integrative research in environmental health science, public health, and bioinformatics. She also plays a leadership role in informatics consortia dedicated to data sharing and semantic engineering. Dr. Haendel's research has focused on integration of genotype-phenotype data to improve rare disease diagnosis and mechanism discovery. She received her Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Oregon and Oregon State University. As an undergraduate, she studied chemistry at Reed College. Dr. Anthony Philippakis is the Chief Data Officer at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, where he is also an institute scientist. Dr. Philippakis is committed to bridging the gap between data sciences and medicine. He's a cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where his primary focus is caring for patients with rare genetic cardiovascular diseases. At the Broad Institute, he directs the Data Sciences Platform, an organization of over 100 software engineers and computational biologists that develops software for analyzing genomic and clinical data. In addition to his roles at the Broad Institute and Brigham and Women's Hospital, he is a venture partner at GV, focusing on machine learning, distributed computing, and genomics. He received his MD from Harvard Medical School and completed a PhD in biophysics at Harvard. As an undergrad, he studied mathematics at Yale University and later studied mathematics at Cambridge University. So we have quite the duo today to lead us in this discussion. And I'm going to start out with Melissa to tell us a bit about her work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sue. Well, it's really my great pleasure to be here today. So thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'll tell a little bit of a background of my sort of scientific trajectory in this space. As Sue had mentioned, my background is in developmental genetics and neuroscience, and I have been slowly marching my way towards the clinical enterprise and towards patients throughout my career. During the time that I worked as a zebrafish genome coordinator, I was found to be tasked to coordinate the structuring of data for genotype, phenotype, and gene expression data, and recognized the incredible power of these data and that they were underused. And at the time, developed some data models and infrastructure to help support what I refer to as sort of a phenotype blast approach, where we took these structured phenotype descriptions of zebrafish and were able to retrieve candidate genes from human diseases to help understand molecular mechanisms of diseases for which we didn't yet know the genetic basis. So this was back in 2009, we published our seminal paper on these technologies. And marching forward to today's world, these technologies are now in wide use in diagnostic tools for rare disease, where we are leveraging model organism data directly in a clinical setting for helping support diagnostics. Our group, as part of the Monarch Initiative program, which is a large consortium, international consortium that helps develop these resources and algorithms, also develops the human phenotype ontology, which is a medical terminology that is structured to describe the patient as a biological subject rather than a billing subject or a clinical encounter subject, as is so often the case with most medical terminologies. By leveraging the kinds of infrastructure that treat the patient as a biological subject, it allows us to compare humans to other organisms much more readily using semantic engineering technologies. And these can be combined with genomic technologies and other kinds of omics technologies to help support clinical decision-making and diagnostic tools. And so it's really exciting time in health science research to be able to leverage so many different kinds of data together in the pursuit of improved patient classification for diagnostics, for prognosis, for mechanism discovery, and hopefully for treatment discovery. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk with Anthony more about his views on some of these same topics. So thank you so much.
Over to you, Anthony.
So thank you so much. I really can't express how honored I am and excited to do this. As Susan knows, my dad was actually a professor at Arizona State for over 30 years. Grew up on the corner of Rural and Baseline in Tempe, and I'm still a Sun Devil at heart. So really, it's just a real pleasure to be here today. So as Susan mentioned, my path in life was that I was a math nerd for all sorts of reasons who went to med school, and have always been really passionate about the opportunity to bring better use of data into the practice of medicine. And one of the things that has happened in recent years is that I've kind of veered much more towards what I'll call the applied or engineering side, in terms of focusing on actually building production grade software systems to store, share, and analyze genomic and clinical data for the betterment of science and medicine. And if I were to summarize one of the motivations that led me in this direction, it actually goes back to my time as a cardiology fellow. And I remember one evening I was on call and a patient was admitted who had had cardiac arrest at the gym. He was a 45-year-old, otherwise healthy man who was on the treadmill and arrested. And fortunately, someone at the gym knew CPR, and he was brought to the hospital in critical condition. And that night stayed up with him trying to keep him alive, and then in the coming weeks did a lot of very elaborate tests on him to try and determine what had caused such a seemingly healthy person to suddenly die, honestly. And did a cardiac MRI, a cardiac catheterization, electrophysiology study. But it turned out that the single most valuable test we did was actually, at some point, embarrassingly far along, was to get in touch with his brother and take a rigorous family history. And when we did that, you ask, is there a history of sudden cardiac death in your family? Oh, no, nobody's had any problems. So is your mother and father alive? No, mom died when she was 25. It was strange, she drowned and was a champion swimmer and nobody ever figured out what happened. What about her brother and sisters? Well, actually, two of her brothers also died in their 40s. One was in a car accident and one fell down the stairs. And sure enough, as you take a family history throughout the family, it certainly seems like this is something that looks like a genetic cause of sudden cardiac death. So we ordered some genetic tests to try and confirm it. And sure enough, there was a variant in a gene known to cause sudden cardiac death that had never been described before in the literature. So the gene was known, but not this variant. And as many of you know, you can have either benign variants in a gene or really bad ones. So we were in kind of a difficult situation because we didn't know whether or not this was the cause of his death. Now you might say, why does it matter? The guy's in critical condition. Why do you care about making an elegant diagnosis? Well, it matters a lot for his family members. He had 5 kids, and 2 of them carried that mutation. One was a rifleman in Afghanistan, and the other was a college student. And at least for the older son that was in the Army, exercise is a big risk factor. You'd have to tell him to quit his job, find a new career, you know, and you wouldn't be at all sure that you would be giving him the right advice. And you could put him on medicines, but they're often very toxic. So sure enough, ended up calling all of the other cardiologists I know who care about genetic diseases. Eventually found another case of a patient somewhere else that had the same variant and had also had cardiac arrest. And while being far from conclusive, really is the kind of thing that it smells good enough that you say, you know, until proven otherwise, we believe that this is the cause. So when you think about all of the data technologies we have and all of the social networks, the fact that something as important to this really came down to just, you know, making phone calls and having other friends that are interested in this is really a tragedy. You know, you should really be having databases that are queryable, where you can search by genotype and find other patients and figure this out in a much more automated and rapid way. And so, you know, this kind of caused me to pivot and really spend, instead of going into more kind of fundamental academic research, really focus on building a team that is dedicated to sharing of genomic and clinical data and applying that knowledge to important problems in the care of patients.
What a wonderful story, or powerful story, and leads us really into the topic of, you know, we often don't get a full history before an appointment, or aren't able to necessarily track health outcomes after an appointment. So we don't get a holistic view of people, which leads to incomplete care, really, or less than optimal care. It can also drive health disparities. Talk to us about how we can leverage health data to put people whole and to have a more comprehensive view and ability to take care of them over time and space, and for their health to be empowered.
Do you want me to take that, Susan? Or maybe let's have Melissa go first. Please, Melissa, go first.
You both take it.
Okay, sure. You know, I think, you know, I really love this topic because we're in such an emergent time of the patient becoming the center of their health universe, rather than this piecemeal set of records that live out in the world about them. There's obviously a lot of technology needs that are yet to be met, and there's a lot of regulatory and sort of process issues that still exist. And furthermore, as you said, Susan, the fact of the matter is that we get such a brief snapshot of the patient in their clinical encounter that we really don't know what's going on in their real world on a day-to-day. And then even in that context of that clinical encounter, you know, we don't have the full picture, and we ask the same questions every time a patient comes in on a piece of paper, you know, about their family history. And then when their family history doesn't agree from the last time they were there or at some other clinic, we don't even notice because they've not, you know, they've not reported it in a consistent way. So, you know, it's very hard to track things like which drugs are they taking, family history issues like Anthony talked about, but also other kinds of data, like thinking about the fact that, you know, when a patient comes into the clinic and, you know, we do some medical imaging, we do genomics, these data then might actually, if we're lucky, go to research databases where they can be used, but they're separated from their clinical data. So it's hard to know what the relevancy of any patterns that we might see in those data really are. And then from the perspective of the patient, you know, thinking about all the other kinds of data that might exist out there, like their dental data or their vision data, or other kinds of public health data that might be really informative, like do they live near, you know, a fuel plant that might have a certain kind of exposure. This kind of information can be really critically important for diagnostics and for, you know, managing care. But we, you know, clinicians rarely have access to those kinds of data in hand for their patients either. And I really think that one of the key ways that we're going to overcome this challenge is to move to a system where the patient becomes the center of their data universe, rather than this spotty collection of information that lives out in the clinical and public world about them. So I think it's an exciting time, especially now with COVID really sort of pushing on some of these technologies rapidly. So I think we can expect to see some changes in that spectrum moving forward.
Yeah, so many thoughts on this topic. So I think one of the things that's unfortunately true is the way that we have approached the construction of electronic medical records has been centered first on billing and the N of one patient, and second about being able to utilize predictive analytics and the N of many patients. And so, when you think about just the way that we organize the data on a patient, it's very set up around each encounter that happens in the healthcare system. And it's also very, if you get your care in different healthcare systems, can be very difficult to move it from one place to another. One of the examples I find kind of most amazing is my hospital, Brigham and Women's Hospital, is physically connected to Boston Children's Hospital. You can walk from one to the other without actually physically going outside. So I stopped practicing about a year ago, but until then I was. And it was amazing to me that I had a lot of patients that would be taken care of at Children's Hospital until they were 18 years old. And then when it came time to transfer their care to the Brigham, they could walk from one building to the next, but when it came to their medical records, they would have to print them out and carry them over. There was no way to transfer them. And then, of course, I would receive, something like 1,000 pages of, notes about a patient. And in the course of a single clinic visit, would have to try and make my way through them. And then I would write a single note that summarized everything that happened to them from the age of 0 to 18, that essentially then would become the source of record for their care going forward in this hospital. Oh my goodness, what a terrible situation. Obviously, it's a lot of pressure on the clinician. There's a huge amount of information that is lost along the way. And this is not even beginning to scratch the surface on all sorts of other data types that are incredibly important to a patient that don't even exist inside of a medical record. For example, your grocery bill probably contains a lot of very important information about your future health outcomes, as does lots of things about your environmental situation and who you live with and who you're caring for. And so when it comes to caring for patients, even the data we have access to from the electronic medical records is very poor and very low fidelity and often wrong. And then there's a whole world of additional data types that we would really like to utilize and just don't have access to. So I think, honestly, this is the data challenge of our time. And I'm sure during the course of this, we'll talk about sort of various ways the situation might be improved going forward.
I want to expand on that and personalize it a little bit in terms of, you have to be part of a medical school or a university medical center or a hospital system in order to access electronic health record data. It's problematic for schools such as Arizona State University and Northern Arizona University that don't have medical schools or university hospitals. You've both been pioneers in, exchange efforts that aim to increase data sharing between hospitals and researchers. I'd love you to talk about your experiences with this, both in regard to what you see are successes and where are the obstacles that you're hoping to overcome.
Terrific. I definitely know that we need to talk about the Matchmaker Exchange that Nancy and I have both worked on together. So this is an initiative that's part of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, and this is a global consortium that's dedicated towards bringing genomic health technologies to everyone around the world. It's a very technical community, really kind of focused on data sharing and data interoperability, but also regulatory differences across countries and making it so that we can overcome some of those barriers. And one of the initiatives is the Matchmaker Exchange, which really aims to support, as Anthony was talking about, finding patients that have similar phenotypes and similar genotypes across the world. And it's been very successful at, helping to find the N of 2 and confirm candidate variants, which have led to, in some cases, identification of treatments and care that have helped improve the lives of those N of 1 patients. And so that's very exciting and a truly wonderful success. And it really takes a village to have built that kind of community around the world. Some of the challenges still, though, are that, not every participating site really shares very much of the phenotype information. And so really, we've been working very hard to think about how we can share structured phenotype information, also in the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, with a resource called Philippakis, which can sort of enhance the way that we share variant information with structured phenotype information that's de-identified in such a way that you could just post them on Facebook, you could put them into your journal articles, and in that way kind of make that phenotypic information about an individual much more computable. So we have these wonderful knowledge bases that help us understand at a sort of population level, patients that have this variant tend to have this set of phenotypes, but we don't really understand specific individuals and the variability of those phenotypes. And when you're talking about rare genetic diseases, you really want to understand that sort of heterogeneity of phenotypic information. So that's really, I think, one of the areas that we need to head towards is making it so that the information, both about the variants and the phenotypic information, can be more broadly shared in a de-identified manner, as well as in a more, kind of closed environment like the Matchmaker Exchange has established. And then also just really focusing on more of the longitudinal phenotypic information so that we can understand individual level disease courses with these patients with these variants in a way that's secure and completely de-identified, but where the knowledge of individuals is actually shared. I think the other thing, well, maybe I'll let Anthony talk about that, but I think we should talk about EHR data after that and sharing EHR data.
Sure, and thank you. So I totally agree with Melissa. It's been a real pleasure. I was very much one of the people who got the Matchmaker Exchange going, along with Melissa. I have been less involved with it lately because honestly, it's doing so well that I felt like there are problems to fix, whereas this one was so functional that I don't know that I had anything to offer. Another effort that I think has been quite successful, and this kind of gets into sharing of EMR data, is an effort that Arizona as a state is actually very involved in, called the US Cohort Program. So, as you know, this is an effort to recruit 1 million or more Americans and get full medical records on them, full genome sequences, follow them longitudinally for decades. And actually, Banner Healthcare in Arizona is one of the key recruiting sites. Actually, honestly, from my perspective, has been one of the most successful and high-performing ones, which is great to see. And so, that's another effort where there are already more than 250,000 people recruited, and all of the sites that they're recruiting from are sending their medical records to a place where researchers can access it. And importantly, the way that this is being done has some notable features. Any qualified researcher can access the data. Every quarter, there's a new release of it. And it's not just the researchers that are funded by the consortium can access it. So it's a very different model that really is kind of much more conducive to broad data sharing than we've seen in the past. There's a phrase that epidemiologists like to be buried with their data. I very much hope that that's a relic of the past in terms of the way medical research will go forward. One of the things I think Susan had also said about is areas where there's need for improvement. And I think we need to reconceptualize how we think about data ownership in healthcare. And this is kind of true on two levels. One is, I think we should get more to a mindset that the patient is the owner of their data, not the medical center or the insurance company that paid for it. And again, I think we'll talk about this more, so I won't say too much about it now. But there's another area that I think is very important, and it will sound kind of wonky and technical, but I actually think a lot of kind of sociologic change will follow from it. And that is, I really hope that healthcare starts to embrace cloud computing, especially public clouds, much more. And the reason I say this is not because I'm, trying to send more money to, Alphabet or Amazon or Microsoft, but rather because, right now, when we talk about data ownership, we often conflate three things. So one thing is to own the computers that the data is stored on. Another thing is to be able to use the data for some research or commercial purpose. And then the third thing is to be able to control who else can access the data. And so, when you put data on a data center at a hospital, all three of those things end up being conflated with one another. And it's very, very difficult to have real data sharing happen beyond the boundaries of the hospital. Whereas when you put data in public clouds, now you're no longer owning the computers that the data is stored on, and really, it's much easier, it's much harder rather, for researchers to hide behind saying, I can't share the data because I can't give you access to my data center, or because my security department blocks it, all sorts of things like that. So I do see cloud computing as a real force for change in how we think about the accessibility of medical data.
Yeah, and I guess I'd like to follow up on that too. I think we've been doing a lot of work recently for COVID on a project called the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, which is trying to extract, well, it is extracting EHR data from now upwards of 70 institutions nationwide, and taking those electronic health record data and leveraging the work that was done in the communities that Anthony already mentioned, like all of us in the Odyssey community, where each of those individual institutions has been putting their EHR data into a common clinical data model so that they can be queried in a distributed fashion. So that allows for example, for any of the All of Us sites to run a query, how many patients, are on ventilators longer than a week, right? And you can get that answer back from each hospital that participates in the Odyssey community. And that's been an absolutely fantastic resource. And there are multiple research networks like this, the PCORNet, ACT, Odyssey, and also a commercial vendor, Trinetics, that supports the same kinds of things. And so there's a lot of efforts to support this distributed querying. But one of the problems is that, well, there's two key problems that I think we're starting to understand how to overcome. One is that you can't do machine learning and large kind of data set applications in these contexts. You can do some statistical and some machine learning types of applications, but you can't really do some of the big data AI type applications on these very small queries. They're just really distributed query networks for the most part, and then you can perform statistics on those queries if you have enough hospitals participating. But what you can do is you can take those data that have already been formatted in that common data model and align those common data models and merge all of those data together into one giant data set. And so this is what we've done for COVID, and it's been a very interesting process, both from a regulatory perspective, as well as a data management and data harmonization perspective. Even data coming from the same data model, models that loads the data differently. Like we can't even represent things like weight with the same units. It's astonishingly different across different institutions. And so when we look back now at how those distributed queries are working, you think about the degree of quality assurance and harmonization that has to happen on the query level. Well, we can actually, when we look at all of the data all at once, we actually have this opportunity to really help each of those individual institutions improve their overall alignment with each other, whether we're using the distributed model or this sort of harmonized aggregate model. And the nice thing about this aggregate model is not only can we deploy some really much more modern AI and machine learning types of applications, but it's in the cloud, and we can actually provision access to it to a fairly broad set of researchers, so long as they are working on COVID and have the proper access permission. So it's been a real, the pandemic has really created this unique opportunity to really grow our capacity to share electronic health record data for research purposes.
Well, there's a lot there to actually expand upon, and I'd love you to talk more, because the National COVID Collaborative N3C is a big deal, and the open science community, that the fact that we know that research and medical management will progress faster if data and knowledge are openly shared. Can you expand on that concept and tell us more about how it's going with and what's being produced from the National COVID Collaborative?
Sure. So I think, you know, I guess there's a lot of questions in there too. You know, I think it's a very interesting social experiment, frankly, to understand, you know, how to help best support the participants that are working on the data and the institutional side, as well as the folks who are working on the analysis side. And there's sort of this whole pipe of data quality and data processing and data harmonization that has to happen. And then even just to analyze the data, we need people who were you know, helping at the source of the data to also help analyze the data, because they understand a lot of the nuances of the data. But it really takes a village in terms of the analysis as well, and how, you know, bringing together clinical experts, statistics experts, people who are experts in machine learning, people who are experts in terminologies and data model harmonization and in the individual sources, and then you know, really deploying you know, sort of standard informatics techniques in a reproducible way. You know, one of the for folks in the audience who might be familiar, there were a couple really important retractions in the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet over observational studies on EHR data that were fully non-transparent and non-reproducible. And even some of the authors didn't actually view the data that on these articles that were published. And this is really the problem, as you were just saying, Susan. Like it's hard to get your hands on data, even if you're like an expert and an author on a paper. And so one of the really exciting things about the N3C is that the entire workflows for the analytics and the data sets and all of their provenance and versioning and sources are fully reproducible and transparent to any reviewers of any manuscript that want to go and reproduce those workflows. That doesn't mean that you can just go in there and look at everybody's data. And it doesn't mean that we have, you know, we've stripped out as many of the HIPAA identifiers as we can, and only kept the two that are most important for studying pandemic response, which is service dates and geocodes, because obviously those are important for understanding a pandemic. But you know, and so there's, you know, this kind of oniony layer of access permissions, and you have a data access committee that's responsible for judging whether or not the research you're proposing requires those HIPAA identifiers or not. We're also generating synthetic data so that a much larger community can use the data much more broadly. But at the end of the day, whether you're using the synthetic data or the tier 1 data, which has those HIPAA identifiers in it, the full workflows will be reproducible, so that when we publish science on these sensitive data, they can actually be transparent and reproducible, and we can evaluate the science based on the true data rather than on hearsay. So I think that's one of the most exciting things about the N3C, as well as giving people attribution for the many hands that it takes to. So part of the reproducibility is also knowing everyone who helped and tracking their contributions.
Yeah. There's a question from a pre-med student that's related to this, and to have you expand a bit more. They ask, what concerns with health information privacy may come up in the improvements in data sharing? Are there risks patients would rightfully want to avoid that would make them opt out? And how can we convince people to opt in?
Sure, I can take this, and I think it's a great question, and have kind of many thoughts on this. So, you know, first, one of the things I've kind of come to believe is that, you know, information security in some ways is not so different than security in the physical world. And there are things that we prevent by policy and retrospectively punishing. And then there are things that we try to prospectively prevent. So, you know, concretely, we put cameras in a convenience store to prevent against shoplifting, but we put metal detectors at the airport, you know, because the ramifications of something wrong there are so much greater. And so when you try to prospectively prevent, you know, you often create a lot of friction in the system, but it also can often be worth it. You know, a lot of things that I think, you know, we've been talking about today are friction points that don't actually improve security, They're much more around kind of incentive structures that are perverse in various ways, honestly. But the risks that you point to of this is often very sensitive, very private data that should not be seen by everyone in the world. And it really should only be seen by someone who's a bona fide researcher, who's trying to use it to improve science and medicine, and who will only be publishing aggregate level insights that don't betray anything that you don't want generally known about you. And so setting up both the policies and the technologies to both kind of minimize friction and that protect research participants is a very challenging thing. And in some ways, I think that this is the data challenge of our time, is to get this right. You know, and something, for example, that I've seen kind of people go back and forth, even over the events of the last two years with Cambridge Analytica and stuff. When all of us first got going, there was a real push towards being able to empower so-called citizen scientists, which is scientists from outside of medical centers who might be able to make great discoveries. And I think everyone agrees that that's a laudable and appropriate thing to do. You know, but then there's the reverse, which is, do you also agree that we don't want a foreign cyber terrorist accessing your data and publishing your whole, re-identifying you by joining to external data sets and then publishing it in a way that can't be pulled back? Well, of course, you know, that is also very important. And, you know, it turns out trying to figure out the, you know, brilliant altruistic 18-year-old researcher in Russia who's trying to do great things, and the cyber terrorist in Russia that is trying to do malfeasance can be very difficult to separate. One of the things that I think the world should really get to is an accreditation system for researchers. You know, this is what we do in healthcare, where in order to deliver care of almost any kind, you have to have some kind of accreditation. And if you do wrong, there are legal repercussions for it. Getting to something very similar for researchers, where there's, you know, formal ethics training, and to some extent you have city courses and stuff like that, but something with a bit more, that's a bit more formalized and regulated, and that also has some legal teeth behind it when there's malfeasance. I think that this is a very important thing for us to get to.
I just want to add on to what Anthony just said. I've long thought that we need a Hippocratic Oath for research, and we do not have that to date.
That's a great point. I want to go back to, you know, you talked about the data. How do we have data be owned by the individual? How do we create those systems that really empower patients? Or what are your thoughts on what that system should look like to take control of their health information, so that, you know, and how can doing that really improve individual and population health outcomes?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts here. You know, one of the things I think is interesting is you can donate a lot of things to medicine. You can donate, you know, your organs. You can donate your blood, but you can't actually donate your data to medical research. And, you know, your data is often what medical research honestly most needs. And I think I could imagine an interesting confluence of things that might lead to a sea change in this issue. You know, more and more, especially rare disease and cancer groups, are kind of saying this very forcefully, that I demand to be able to access my data and donate it. I think that's a rallying cry that a lot of people are starting to get behind. Moreover, as part of healthcare reform, so-called Meaningful Use 3, there's a legal requirement that anybody should be allowed to ask for their data in a standardized format and have it given to them. And you know, so far that has not really been tested, and most medical systems just technically are not set up to be able to export a medical record in a standardized format. But, you know, I could imagine a day that comes when you start to see the rise of a real social movement, where, you know, especially patients with rare diseases or cancer start demanding access to their data from medical centers, and that it be exported in standardized form. And then you'll also see the rise of organizations that are there ready to catch it and make it available to researchers. This doesn't seem so far-fetched to me, and I could actually see it being the tipping point in kind of a reframing of how we think about health data, who owns it, who can access it, and for what purpose.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because I have this test every time I go to the doctor and they make you sign the form that says that they won't share your data. I say, no, I want to sign the form that says I can donate my data to medical research. And they say, well, we don't have that form. So, and I'm waiting for the day when that form will appear. And I think that, that's really should be the patient's choice. I should be able to decide when and where and with whom I share my data. Even maybe if we start a little bit smaller and just say, okay, I would like my data in the health system X or in state X to be accessible to researchers for purpose Y, and to be able to have that sort of fine tuning to make those decisions yourself and to do so in an informed way. That's the other thing. I think that, even with, deposition of other kinds of samples, the consent forms are often not very, things are written in small print, and the ramifications of the use of that, those samples are not necessarily so clear to the patients. And with data, it's even more imperative that we really teach people what the ramifications are so that they can make the best decisions for themselves, and where genetic data is concerned, for their families, because obviously when you share your own personal genetic data, you're also sharing your family's genetic data. And so there's those implications as well. But I completely agree that the patient needs to become the sort of center of those permission giving universes, and needing to evolve the medical systems to be able to support, again, it comes back to that data harmonization issue and standardization issue. The sort of processes of data capture within any given clinical setting are still just so different from setting to setting, that even when we are able to capture the data out the other end in a way, we're still going to have this very large challenge of just not capturing data in the same way, and it's not very interoperable. So there's a lot to do on how data is encoded at the point of source, as well as after it gets shared.
And to go back some to what COVID has done to our world, and it's really, in some ways, there's been successes in improved and increased speed at which data is shared between institutions and sectors. For instance, how quickly the virus was sequenced and published in terms of its genome. What do you see are the successes, and how can we learn from them so that we don't sort of go back to old ways of doing things?
You want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. I think one of the big successes, honestly, is, and maybe not noticed enough, is clinical trials and showing the scope of the possible. So there was the recovery trial in the UK that got enrolled or got going and approved and IRB approved and designed in record time, and within a matter of months of the outbreak was yielding results like, for example, dexamethasone has a mortality benefit. Many people I know who are seasoned trialists thought that moving that quickly would be impossible. And it has become an exemplar that it actually can be done if you have sufficient motivation. And I think it's an existence proof that maybe a lot of aspects of our clinical trial apparatus should be rethought. And then even again, I think we're all very excited about the results that came out on Monday from Pfizer and the vaccine. And again, being able to go from not knowing the existence of the virus in January to actually having a vaccine trialed successfully is really a sight to behold. And I think we as a species should feel very proud at how far we've come. This is one way in which the current year is very different than the Spanish flu, long ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another area that we're thinking about, just in terms of like reconnecting data. So if you think about how fast the genome was sequenced and the amount of data sharing that's happening for both host and viral genomes in the context of COVID is just outstanding. But again, it's not connected to the clinical data. We can share all this genomic data over here, and then we can share all this clinical data over here. But how do we interpret the changes in, the differences in both viral and host genomes with clinical outcomes? And so I think, there's some really exciting pilots that we're starting now for hashing data where we can reassociate those patients, host and viral sequences from within an institution back with their clinical records so that we can actually do those larger scale multimodal analytics with sensitive data, but only when the institutions have the regulatory control for doing that. And so there, I think that's a really exciting notion. Again, it's about putting the patient back together again. And similar to the imaging data, we're doing a pilot with that as well to think about how do we, leverage kind of AI applications on the images with the clinical data simultaneously by using these types of hashing technologies.
Yeah. And on the point of clinical trials, common disease clinical trials, although very much needed, are often less prioritized than clinical trials for rare diseases and cancers. Why are they important to improve population health outcomes? And how can we leverage partnerships with medical centers to increase access in common disease clinical trials?
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful topic and one that I'm very passionate about. One of the things that I started med school in 2001, which is the year that Gleevec was approved, and then also the trials for Avastin, which was an anti-angiogenesis, were getting going. And I remember everyone kind of was betting on Avastin as the kind of cure for many cancers, and people saw Gleevec and they said, "What? This is crazy. Are we going to make a different drug for every mutation and every cancer? We'll need hundreds of drugs." And sure enough, what's happened over the last 20 years is that drug development has really become focused almost exclusively on rare diseases and cancer. And that's mainly because the cost of running a trial for common disease is so large relative to those. And don't get me wrong, I'm very in favor of drug development for rare diseases and cancer. But I am quite dismayed that when you look at the kind of top 10 causes of death in the world, the number of people that are still trying to make drugs for heart attack, stroke, diabetes is dwindling. And here's an example of why. When you look at, let's say, a typical cardiology trial for MI, would typically take 20,000 patients to run it for about 5 years. And the event rate, which is to say the number of people who have death or MI or stroke, is often about 10%, which means that 90% of your trial is wasted. And so, this is quite a state of it. Usually the cost is around $1 billion. So a few innovations have happened in the last few years that I think are very exciting. The first is, using genomic and clinical data to both better select patients that will respond to a drug and to increase the event rate so that now you can run much smaller trials. And then second is a lot of the work that's come out of the UK, and I mentioned the recovery trial and similar other trials where pharmaceutical companies have been able to partner with the UK government, access health data to identify patients who meet inclusion and exclusion criteria, and therefore run the trial for a much smaller cost than would typically be expected. So I think there's a huge opportunity for a partnership between medical centers and the drug development industry to leverage health data to run much more efficient, streamlined trials where we're finding people that will most benefit from the drug and being able to more rapidly recruit them into the trial and follow them longitudinally.
One of the things that I'm really excited about what you just said, Anthony, was really about sort of the inclusion exclusion criteria and how do we help support more rapid classification of patients. So really building computable strategies to help identify those patients so that we can run smaller trials and iterate in a more sort of nimble manner in these trial contexts for more common diseases. And I think that really gets after a more general problem of just patient classification. Really every patient is an N of one. The question is, what are the useful classifications that help us, identify the correct treatment or the correct diagnosis? And in the case of trials for common diseases, that becomes critically important to reduce the cost and create the nimbleness that is needed. So I think that as some of those strategies for classification, for inclusion, exclusion criteria, as well as just many other aspects of classifying patients, really start to become more robust, we're going to start to see some improvements in that area.
I want to personalize it again and get your thoughts to sort of help Arizona. We have a pretty dynamic zone in Phoenix it's the Phoenix Biomedical area corridor zone. We're still working on the name, but all three state universities have a presence there in health. Edson School of Nursing, the College of Health Solutions, the College of Medicine, University of Arizona, Phoenix, and Northern Arizona University has fabulous programs and physician assistants, OT-PT, et cetera. How do, and I think both of you, both in Oregon and certainly the MIT Broad, Harvard hospital systems, have to work together. How do we foster that and leverage, particularly when it comes to infrastructure in the data space? What would be your pearls of wisdom?
I think Anthony already said it, cloud. Cloud and really, really excellent access and security management. It makes things go so much easier for management, but it's not a magic. It's not magic. Just because you have it in the cloud doesn't make it all happen. It takes really good governance. There's still backup issues. There's still security issues and the like. But it does make it much sort of technology-wise much easier to share sensitive data across institutions.
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with Melissa. And kind of further areas that I think are real room for opportunity. I think the analogy of how MIT works with a lot of hospitals in Boston is an interesting one. MIT doesn't have a medical school, but it is unquestionably, one of the great centers of medical innovation. And it really was quite aggressive about building partnerships with various hospitals who were eager to tap into the intellectual resources of the institution. And in particular, I think there are a few things that Arizona State really has going for it. First, like MIT, there's an outstanding tradition of engineering of all forms, and also computer science, computer information systems. And so, that's a real resource. Second, one of the truly great healthcare, or some of the truly great healthcare systems in the world are in Arizona. You think about the Barrow Neurologic Institute is, world-class in neurosurgery. Mayo Clinic has, which is, in my opinion, honestly, maybe the greatest American healthcare system, has one of its 3 outposts in Arizona. I would love to see, I guess one advice I would have is to really try and build deeper relationships with those groups and to have a lot of software engineering and data science be core to them. Arizona State is a great home for software engineers, more so maybe than, a lot of traditional medical institutes. And so what, the lack of a medical school can actually be in some ways more of an opportunity than a challenge. Although I will say, as someone who, my dad was very involved in academic administration, and the number of times, I hope I don't offend anyone, that he would say, the goddamn Board of Regents still won't let ASU have a med school. So I'm sorry about that.
Well, I agree that there's opportunity without having a med school. Well, we just have a few more minutes, and I wonder if you both want to just, I wouldn't say summarize, but closing comments in terms of data science and health as we move forward.
Well, I guess I would just, first of all, like to thank everyone for joining us today, and please don't hesitate to reach out. If you're interested in COVID, join our COVID project. We need all the help we can get. But I think, maybe my closing comment would really just be, imagine big. There's a lot of data out there that is not being leveraged to maximize health or health research or health outcomes. And it really does take a village. It takes those computer scientists in Arizona working together with clinicians and basic science researchers and caregivers and public health epidemiologists and just an army of different areas of expertise. And the more we can connect our data and the more we can think big about how we can move data around, the more value we're going to get out of the data.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree very much with Melissa. In a lot of the things we talked about today, we talk about things that are hard or things that we wish were different. One thing I do hope everyone here feels is, this is a time to be tremendously optimistic. One of my kind of passions in life is history of science and history of mathematics. And, I often kind of imagine 200 years from now, what will people think about this era as, I wish I was alive then because this exciting thing was going on. And I think that what, our era will be marked by is two intellectual revolutions that kind of grew up in parallel. One is the information technology revolution that really accelerated in the 90s with internet, and then, obviously now into the machine learning era. And then in parallel, you have the kind of biotechnology revolution with the rise of genomics and genome editing and recombinant DNA and all these other things. And what there really is the opportunity for these two fields, which are independently incredible, to actually come together. And I assume that because you spent an hour listening to Melissa and I, you're interested in that intersection. And I do feel it really is kind of chocolate and peanut butter to be someone working in this space at this time.
Chocolate and peanut butter is a good place to leave off.
Love it.
Just gonna make sure there's no more questions. I really want to thank you both for your participation in our series. It's been really interesting and stimulating. Wonderful to get the two of you together as well. Different sides of the country, but both working in such an important space. And I know you already knew each other, but this was really fruitful for us. So thank you both, Melissa and Anthony. And thank you all of our participants. We did tape this, so it will be available later. And we hope you'll join us for next week, our last in the series of our Biomedical Innovation Speakers Series. So thank you all and stay safe and well.
Thank you, Susan.